California is facing many challenges, and we've covered some of them on this show, but still is one of the top economies in the world and one of the most desirable places to be at. Our guest today is Steve Hilton, who's a director of strategy for British Prime Minister David Cameron back in the day. He recently authored a book called Califailure. Steve believes that the state philosophy and state policies are causing a lot of the challenges that we see.
I was just in Texas. In Austin, they're building ships for the Navy that used to be done here, and they're sending them to San Diego. You look at the exodus of businesses in every sector. I mean, it's really frightening, actually.
I'm Siamak Korami. Welcome to California Insider. Steve, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
I've been wanting to sit down and talk with you for so long. It's fantastic to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. You're a TV host, and you're British. You came to California, and you've been covering California a lot. And you just recently wrote a book about California's failures, and you have some solutions. Can you tell us what you see in California when you started writing this book?
Well, the first thing I want to say is what I see in California is the best of America. That's how I think of California. It's an inspirational place. It inspired me before we even lived here. There's a line in my book which is, I think, very profound in terms of capturing how I think of California, which is California means to America what America means to the world. What I mean by that is if we think about all the great things about America, and you say I'm British, I'm actually American now, just for avoidance of doubt, I got my citizenship
well, congratulations
a few
on
years
that.
ago. I'm very proud as an American, very proud Californian. But I think of California as representing the essence of America, the best things. When we think about what America means, that should be California. Innovation and energy and opportunity and ambition and hustle and the rebel spirit, all these things, that's California, or it should be. But I think that in recent years, that spirit has been crushed by bad policies and bad ideas. And that's why I wrote the book. It's called Califailure, Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State. Because I think California, if you actually just look at the data, it is the worst run state in America. That sounds like a strong statement, maybe a little bit partisan, but if you actually look at the data on every measure that matters, we are the worst performing state in America. We have the highest rate of poverty, we have the highest taxes, the highest cost for housing, gas, electricity, water, every essential. We have the lowest income growth. Last year, 2024, for most of the year, we had the highest unemployment rate in America. Right now, it's number 2. I could go on. We have the worst business climate. That's insane. California, the worst business climate, the home of enterprise and innovation. Chief Executive Magazine, every year, they do a survey of which states are better or worse to do business in. California has been bottom of all 50 states for 10 years. So it's a total failure. I mean, there's more than that. I mean, we just go through every issue. And it's not that we're in the middle of the pack or, 41st out of 50. It's literally the worst on all of these measures. And so I wanted to try and explain why. How has this happened? How has this amazing place ended up performing so poorly? But not just to diagnose the problem, but to lay out a solution. So the book's called Califailure, but part 2 of the book is called Califuture. And that is a set of changes that we need to make that will restore the California dream and restore California to the glory that I know we all want, everyone who lives here, and not just everyone who lives here. I think everyone in America cares about California
and the
being
whole
successful.
world as well.
World.
Like there's an element where people from Europe watch us because they want to know what's going on.
100%. It's an inspiration to the world. And as you mentioned, I've recently been known in America as a TV host, but prior to that, I've been an entrepreneur. And back in the day in the UK, I worked in politics and the government. I was senior advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron. I'm a policy guy. And so that's what's so frustrating to me, in a sense, is that all these problems that we have in California, the fact that 1/3 of Californians, according to a recent study, cannot meet their basic needs, food, shelter, it's terrible. But these are driven by bad policy. And so we've got to analyze the policy failures that led to this and then put forward a plan for turning things around. And that's what this book, Califalia, is all about.
When was the moment that you realized things are not going the direction they should be going in California?
Not so much in terms of the direction of the state, but there was a moment that I realized how much I cared about California. We moved here in 2012 with my family, and it was actually for work reasons, in the sense that my wife had a job in the Bay Area and she was traveling a lot, and when our second son was born, it became complicated, so we moved. But we didn't know at the time that it would be a permanent move. It was just for the time being to make it work from a family perspective. But then in 2016, I remember this so clearly, I went back to the UK to campaign for Brexit. That was the year of the Brexit referendum, which I felt very strongly about, and I'd advocated for leaving the EU for many years. So when that campaign came up, I went back and took part in it for a couple of weeks. And I remember so clearly landing back at San Francisco airport as the plane just was taxiing in, just looking out the window, and I just thought to myself, oh, it's so great to be home. And that I just, oh, that's interesting. This is home. That's how I think about it. And I do think of California as not just my literal home, where we're raising a family and I've started a business here and taught at Stanford University and now this new career in media, all those things. It's also, in a sense, spiritually my home. I feel so connected to the values and ideals and the spirit of California that's why I feel so strongly that we can't let it slide into this failure. It's not okay to let that happen. And so as the years went on and frankly, the problems got worse. I mean, by the way, when I was listing all those problems, we didn't even talk about the most visible problems. If you ask people around the country what's wrong with California, the ones they, because it's so much, so vivid, they talk about homelessness. Of course, we have the highest homelessness rate. We have 11% of the US population, 47% of the homeless population, crime, etc. And so as those problems were piling up and the reputation of California was being ruined, I just felt more and more drawn to, in a way, going back to what I used to do, which is not just talking about things. My media career is very late and unexpected, but actually working to solve problems, like I used to do back in the day in the UK as a policy guy in the government.
When you started doing that, what did you notice?
Well, there's two components to it. Very simply, the two parts of it are one-party rule combined with bad ideas. And those two things together prove to be a disaster. But you need both to make such a calamitous outcome, because let's just take the one-party rule. When you have one-party rule, which is what we've had in California with the Democrats controlling all statewide offices for nearly 20 years, both houses in the legislature, the cities, the counties, and the biggest, where the most population is in California, and so on, it breeds a kind of arrogance and complacency. And the politicians lose touch with the people. They're not paying attention to the needs of the people because they're worried about their internal politics, navigating the machine. They don't care. They assume that their party will be in power because of this one-party rule. They don't see a challenge coming from the other side. So it makes it less competitive. And that's unhealthy. It's unhealthy to have this lack of political balance. And so you've got this situation where increasingly the orientation of the people in charge, the Democrat politicians, has been to their own extremes. The activists, the people with the loudest voices, the people who pay for their campaigns, the unions, especially in California, the lawyers, the trial lawyers. That's why we have such a problem with litigation in California. So they pay attention to those interests, not the interests of the public, because they feel they don't need to compete for votes because they're going to win anyway. So that's the first part, the one-party rule. And we can talk in a second about how that happened. That's an interesting story. But the second part is that one-party rule combined with really bad ideas. And that's what I try and get into in Califalia is what are these ideas? Where did it come from? Because it's not just they're Democrats and they're on the left. You have Democrats in power elsewhere. It's not as bad as this. What you've seen in California is an ideological experiment. A really, really unconstrained experiment. I describe it in the book that they've turned California into the Wuhan lab of far-left extremism. They've been cooking up this ideological virus, and it's escaped in California, but it's actually spread beyond California because so many of the bad things that are causing problems around the country started in California. The extremism on climate change policy, on gender and race, and you can go through the list of things. Banning gas cars, and so it's all in California. There's many more. So it didn't stop in California, but it started here and has had the worst effects here. So I'm trying to explain what this ideology is. What are the components of it? And actually, the way I structured the first part of Califalia is to describe them as pathologies, because they don't make sense otherwise. Most of these ideological obsessions on a practical level don't make sense. They're actually counterproductive, even in their own terms. A simple example is on climate change policy, which actually I think is the driver of a lot of the problems in California, the costs that people have to bear and so on. Let's just take one subset of that, energy policy. Not that long ago in California, a few decades ago, we produced 80% of the oil that we use in California. And we use a lot of oil, and even after all this war on fossil fuels, the proportion of California's energy that comes from fossil fuels is 80%. If you add total energy, not just
gas
electricity.
and power and everything.
Everything, 80%. In the rest of America, it's 81%. It's basically the same. But what's changed is where it comes from. So a few decades ago, we would produce 80% of it here in California, mostly in Kern County, and import about 20%. Now it's flipped. We import 80% of our oil. And we're using a bit less, just purely in terms of oil, but not that much less, 7%, something like that, less than those days. So we're importing it. Where's it coming from? Countries like Iraq, halfway across the world. There's no pipelines for oil into California. There are no oil pipelines. So it all has to be brought in by ship. They are shipping in oil on giant supertankers fueled by bunker fuel, it's called. It's the lowest grade of petroleum.
So it's really dirty, right?
It's the dirtiest possible. It's the most polluting form of transportation on the planet. So instead of producing it here in California and taking it in a nice clean pipeline from Kern County to the refineries on the coast near LA, we're shipping it halfway across the world, increasing carbon emissions. So in the name of climate, they are increasing carbon emissions. So that makes no sense at all. No normal person would do that unless they are captured by something that is not practical. It's ideological, and it's actually pathological. Because why would you do something so stupid and counterproductive even to your own stated goals? Because they have this pathology that they want to show that they are taking action on climate. And so in the book, I call that chapter climatism. It's not climate. It's something weirder than just fighting climate change. It doesn't make any sense. And if you go through the issues, that's all a bit like that. It's totally ideological. And so that's what I try and do in the book, is really unpack the ideology. And of course, some of it is more familiar than others. You've got socialism, and they've grown the government so enormously. The budget of the state of California has nearly doubled in the last 10 years, even as our population's been falling after inflation. Bureaucratism, just the unbelievable, sprawling, bloated government bureaucracy telling everyone what to do. It's almost impossible to get anything done.
Some of you may be wondering, why are we talking about Shenyun on California Insider? It's a dance about China, but ancient China. I'm a big fan of Shenyun. I've been to it 14 times. Every year I go. The first time I went to Shenyun, it was so amazing. It was so uplifting. The colors, the energy, they put you into scenes of thousands of years ago. And you feel like how the ancient people lived. And you get to appreciate the history of humanity. There's a lot more to this show. It's going to be here in Southern California, and I want to make sure you guys go see it. You don't want to miss this show. You have to see it at least once. And make sure to tell us what you think afterwards.
It was spectacular, so beautiful.
I thought I was going to heaven.
Oh, it was electric.
I'm getting chills talking about it.
It gets a 10 from me, that's for sure.
It was that good.
Absolutely marvelous.
Hands down the best show I've ever seen.
Before you mentioned that you want to explain to us how we got here, where there's one party and
Yes.
people have to satisfy the party
Yes.
than the people that are voting for them or the general public.
That's a great summary, exactly.
How
Satisfy
did
the
we
party,
get-
not the people.
How did we get there?
So the first step, actually, which may surprise a lot of people, I think, and this is how I trace it back in California, goes back to Governor Reagan, who was the first to grant collective bargaining rights to public unions, public government unions. Now he did it when he was governor in the turn of the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and it was initially collective bargaining rights were given to the police and the firefighters. And he was trying to support these workers for the public good who were under attack at the time. It was the 60s and it was a supportive gesture. But actually it started a process whereby the unions became the most powerful force in California politics. Because after Reagan did it with those categories, bit by bit, it was extended, especially by Jerry Brown when he was governor, to all state employees and then local government employees, and then you end up with a situation where you have the government unions today in California, because they sit on both sides of the negotiating table. That's why it's so pernicious. FDR, President Roosevelt, a Democrat associated with expansive government and so on, argued that government unions are unconstitutional, that it's not right to have the unions who are employed by the public sector negotiate with the government in that way. And so what you've ended up with is this incredibly powerful political bloc. They get paid by the taxpayer. They collect the dues, which are basically taxpayer money from the members of the union, and then they use it to elect politicians who give them deals and give them favors. It's totally corrupt. It's obviously corrupt. The unions spend $1 billion a year in California, political donations, $1 billion. It's
$1 billion?
$1 billion in California.
For all of the races?
Yes.
A year?
Yes. It's an enormous...
Is that all in political donations?
Yes. And it's unbelievably effective. And they use it in very cynical ways to get what they want. A really good example, and we're speaking here in Orange County. So just in this last election cycle, the unions support in a Democrat-Republican race in the state legislature, the unions supported a Republican candidate. Why? Because the Democrat candidate had dared to defy the unions by, I can't remember the exact detail, it's in the book, either writing or promoting a bill or taking a position on an issue that the unions didn't approve of. To punish this Democrat legislator in order to send a message to keep everyone else in line, they said, right, we're going to support the Republican. And everyone said, you wouldn't. Why would you do that? You don't agree with them. We're just going to send a message, keep everyone in line. Because of the arrogance of one-party rule, because they have a supermajority in the legislature, the Democrats, what does it matter if they lose one seat to a Republican, if it keeps the rest of the Democrats in line? That's how arrogant they are, but also how powerful they are. They send a message. I remember the first issue that I worked on as I was getting into this whole California policy world was housing, because it's the foundational problem in many ways. It's the number one reason people are leaving California, ridiculous cost of living. And housing is the main component. We have the highest housing costs in America. The typical house price, the median house price right now, $909,000. Insane. Nearly $1 million. That means that's the median. That means half the homes in California cost more than $1 million. In the Bay Area, it's 1.7 million. Amazing. So I worked on that issue. And we can get into the policy detail, but for this part of our conversation, I'll just tell you a story, which was I actually ended up proposing a ballot initiative to fix the problem with two components. Ending environmental lawsuits, they're fake environmental lawsuits under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. 70% of those lawsuits are used to block housing. Most of them are filed by the unions, not environmental groups, unions, to extract leverage against house builders, higher wages, but not just higher wages. We all want higher wages, 4 times market rate. Union member only work sites, etc. They're called project labor agreements.
So they sue to actually get them to use the unions?
Use the unions or pay, but the two components usually are, they call it skilled and trained, which means you have to use these euphemisms. You have to use union members only, or prevailing wage. That's the other term, which actually means, literally 4 times as high in some cases. So that's one component of it. So one element of the ballot initiative was to remove what's known as the private right of action under CEQA. So right now, anyone can file a lawsuit under CEQA, anyone.
And stop construction.
And stop everything in its tracks. Even if a project is compliant with the actual law, you just make something up. They literally make things up. Now we're in it, let's talk about it. For example, there have been stories of people filing lawsuits on housing construction because of the fact that housing contains windows, and windows are a threat to bird life because a bird can strike a window, stuff like this. Ridiculous. Mostly by the unions. And so the first item, the ballot initiative have 2 components, which is this issue. Again, to explain the scale of it, right now in California, there are over 1 million housing units blocked by these lawsuits. They're compliant with every other. They're compliant with CEQA.
They just have to wait to deal with this.
Yes, they're in a process, whatever, and then half the time, of course, all the time that's going on, the developers borrowing money to fund they just give up, or whatever. It takes 6 years, 12 years, 20 years. And the second component of the ballot initiative was this other aspect of the housing crisis that no one is aware of until I started digging into it, which is called impact fees. Impact fees, in theory, were, as the name suggests, a small charge to take account of the impact on a local community of building housing.
For schools, infrastructure?
No, not schools. Remember, we already pay taxes for that.
Is it for infrastructure, the city?
A park, public
Sewage
art,
or
a nice
water.
and tree planting, like little extra. No, we pay the highest taxes in the country. This is not included in that. This is fees.
Is completely different.
This is not taxes. We pay property taxes for the schools. So that no one should be under any illusion here. This is on top of basic taxes. You could call it a housing tax. I think we should, because that's what it is. But it's not paid. It's paid by the developer. And you have to add it up. There's 5, and it used to be small amounts.
The consumer doesn't see it. The buyer does
Exactly,
not see
it goes into the house price. You have to pay it. The Turner Center in Berkeley on housing does the research. Again, the typical impact fees, when you add them all up, per unit of housing in California, $150,000.
Wow.
Yeah, right. So that's right. That just pure tax on top. So the second component of our initiative was to cap impact fees. Anyway, I want to go back to the point about the unions, because as part of getting this going, I was talking and, trying to get allies and, trying to make something happen, raise money, all this kind of stuff. And we went to Sacramento often. And I had a meeting, I never forget it, in the office of a Democrat lawmaker known for being good on housing. And I've been in the meeting, they said, well, totally agree. This is a nightmare, this litigation. This would be transformative if we could make this change. That's fantastic. So you'll support it and we'll work on it. Bipartisan, great. I said, no, why not? The unions won't accept it. I said, well, who cares? I mean, I obviously, because it takes away a powerful tool in their arsenal, but like, so what? I'll never forget what happened. We're sitting in an office overlooking the Capitol in Sacramento. They just waved their arm like that. Well, the unions run this place. So the one-party rule, the union role is very, very, they run the government in Sacramento right now. And the unions themselves, in many cases, particularly if you look at the teacher unions, and some of the, have become very militant. They've been controlled. They themselves have been taken over by far-left activists. I mean, you just look at the Los Angeles branch of the teacher unions when they published their demands for reopening the schools after the pandemic. We had the worst and longest school closures in the country, totally unjustified. That's a whole other conversation. But the teacher unions' demands for reopening the schools in LA were a wealth tax, Medicare for all, just totally unconnected.
So it's gone
they're
beyond
political.
So
that's the first point. Sorry to.
Yeah.
The second is the power of the unions in this one-party system, and of course they have made it happen by funding the Democrat politicians and building this formidable political machine. On top of that, you have, remember the dynamic for a lot of the bad things in California. I mean, people, because it's an easy thing to, you focus on the governor and Newsom and people attack Newsom. The real dynamic tends to be the legislature passing really bad legislation, extreme, ideologically driven legislation in vast amounts. And then the governor signs it. Now, the criticism of the governor is, well, why aren't you pushing back? Why you're supposed to be the leaders. We can get into that. But the legislature is the problem in driving a lot of this stuff. They have a supermajority, so they can do whatever they want, a 2/3 majority in both houses, have had since 2012. How did that happen? Not legitimately. If you look at the vote share for Republicans in California, I did the numbers. Since the last time a Republican won statewide in California was 2006, Arnold Schwarzenegger's re-election. So if you take all the statewide elections since then and take the average Republican share of the vote, it's 41.7%. And if you just look at the performance of statewide candidates, the last governor against Newsom, the Republican had no money really and no campaign really. A good guy, I supported him, I tried to do what I could to help him, knew the policy would have been great, but didn't have, the machine and the money compared to Gavin Newsom. But Brian Darley, the Republican candidate, got 40.8%, I think, 41%. In other words, it's a very, very stable, let's call it 40%, Republican support in California, which is a lot higher than many people think. Is the Republican support, Republican representation in the legislature 40%? No. It's not 40, it's not 35, it's not 30, it's not 20. But until this last election, it was 20%. Half what the actual support in the state is. How did that happen? In 2008, California passed a ballot initiative on redistricting, supposed to deliver independent redistricting. It was totally hijacked by the Democrat machine. And so they put in all these things that were not in the initiative. One good example, the intent of the initiative was not only to take the power to draw the districts from the legislature, give it to an independent commission, but also that the district should reflect, wherever possible, existing community boundaries, cities, counties, whatever, and try and sort of keep those communities together. They inserted a new criterion called communities of interest, which could be anything. They literally argued that the 99 highway in the Central Valley was a community of interest, so they could draw the districts to favour them. It's gerrymandering. And that's why you end up with 40% support for Republicans in statewide, but 20% representation in the legislature. So that's not right. If you had fair representation for Republican votes in the legislature, there wouldn't be a supermajority. There wouldn't be, so they couldn't just ram all this extreme legislation through. So it's those things together that have created the conditions for this endless barrage of ideologically driven extremist legislation that then turns into the insane bureaucracy and regulation and sprawling nanny state madness that is ruining California.
Now, do you think if that were to happen, if that representation will come to 40%,
Yes.
do you think California will get better?
Yes. Well, first of all, just that one change. If Republicans had fair representation in the legislature, it would stop the supermajority, and then it would be harder for the Democrat machine to push through extremist legislation. Just that change. But actually, it would be more than that, because you could, I mean, it's not enough just to stop the bad stuff. You need to implement good things. And so actually, I think the story there is that you need to elect Republicans statewide to start to reverse some of these terrible policies and put in place solutions to these problems on the housing crisis and the cost of living. All these things have solutions. And they're in my book, in Califalia, in part 2, Califuture. So really, it's not a mystery. We've had one-party rule for nearly 2 decades, more if you look at the legislature, and it's a total failure. So what's the answer? You can't keep giving power to the people who made the mess. You've got to vote for new people. We need change in California. That's the answer. But actually, if we get that political change, I think the policy solutions are not, I'm not saying they're easy, but they're not conceptually complicated.
California is home to some of the most innovative companies of the world. Why do you think these companies are not involved in helping with solving these problems? Or are they involved, and are they ideologically aligned with?
Well, let's talk about that whole thing, because it's very interesting. And you see from the Democrat side, they often will say, I hear Gavin Newsom say this the whole time, well, we're the 5th biggest economy in the world if we were a country. So obviously we're doing well. And that's true. And it's great. As a Californian, I'm proud that we're the 5th biggest economy. But imagine how well we would be doing if we didn't have all these barriers to growth and prosperity and success that are holding us back. We'd be the 3rd biggest. That's what I'd like us to get to. But even within the current setup, we have a big economy, but it's not working for people, because a lot of these companies, they're tech monopolies that generate huge amounts of revenue but don't employ very many people. That's why you can have at the same time 5th biggest economy, highest unemployment in the country at the same time. I think that the truth is that for the big businesses, they can cope with this stuff, especially those kinds of businesses, because they're so profitable, so that they can employ the compliance people and the lawyers. I mean, all the endless litigation and but if you're a small company or a medium-sized company, it's a nightmare. And that's why they're leaving. And you're seeing businesses leave. And it's accelerating. So I think there's a lot of complacency on the part of the Democrats and probably the whole state that this is just going to keep going, that the goose is going to keep laying the golden egg. No. I mean, I was just in Texas. In Austin, they're building ships for the Navy that used to be done here, and they're sending them to San Diego on trucks because it makes more sense. You look at the exodus of businesses in every sector. I mean, it's really frightening, actually, because you could see, and I don't want to be melodramatic, but you can imagine a real collapse of the California economy, where people just say, we just can't put up with this anymore. And the people and businesses that are left are the ones that can't move. You can't just pick up your farm and move to another state. But what is happening is farms are shutting down, which is a tragedy. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the Central Valley. What's happening to our agriculture industry, the greatest in the world, is a crime. They're deliberately crushing the industry. Again, going back to what we said earlier, because of ideology. You can't have the water, you can't have this, it's climate. It's really outrageous. But I think that the reason that you haven't seen more of an engagement by the business community is that they have tended to fight their individual battles, the things that directly affect them. There's a particular piece of legislation that will affect our business, our industry, our sector. We'll lobby for that. We'll do what we can. We'll bribe the legislators, donate money to the legislators, etc. But whereas the unions are in a broader fight to just keep the power, keep the Democrats in power, whereas the businesses are more engaged in a narrow fight for their particular cause. But while that's all happening, this state has become completely inhospitable, hostile to business, hostile.
What about the voters? Because we are voting these people in, and we are voting the legislature.
Well, speak for yourself. I'm not voting for these people.
So a lot of Californians are voting for them. 60% of Californians, you mentioned 60%.
Yeah.
Is what's getting implemented what the voters want? Or
if you look at individual issues, there's no question that people know we need change. I mean, just look at the vote for Proposition 36 last year, 2024, on crime, where 70% support for that measure, which was opposed by all the leading Democrats. People forget that now. Gavin Newsom was fiercely opposed to Proposition 30. He put a lot of money and effort and all the Democrat machine. It was no on 36. It passed with 70% on crime because people are so fed up with crime. And they rejected the Democrat position, and it was the Democrat position. And in that particular issue of crime and Prop 36, you could say it was Republican 70, Democrat 30 on the issue of crime. But actually on other issues, I mean, that got all the headlines as the high-profile one, but also voters rejected a massive tax increase in the form of a bond that was on the ballot. They rejected rent control. An increase in the minimum wage was defeated. Left-wing Democrat positions were defeated. Then you look individually at, obviously, George Gascon in LA, defeated in the Bay Area, San Francisco mayor defeated. Alameda County DA, mayor of Oakland, etc. 10 counties across California flipping from blue to red, including Fresno, big ones like Fresno, big city there, the 5th biggest in the state. Huntington Beach in Orange County. Really an inspiring story there, where not that long ago, four and a bit years ago, the council was 6-1 controlled by Democrats. In 2022, a strong slate of Republican candidates led by Tony Strickland. They called themselves the Fab Four, and they ran on a common sense conservative platform. They won 4-3. And then they started implementing the things they said they would do, cleaning up the streets, homelessness, crime, what's going on in schools, etc. They ran a slate of candidates in November 2024. They called themselves the Magnificent Seven. I mention that because they weren't running away from Donald Trump just because it's California. Quite the opposite. They were leaning into it. They won all 7 seats. So you have a city council gone from 6-1 Democrat to 7-0 Republican in 4 years. And just been rated, Huntington Beach, I read it this morning as we're taping this, just rated the best run city in California. So I think there's an energy for change.
You have another part of your book, which is the Cali future. So what does that look like in your thoughts?
I think the 2 words that captured it, I'm going to use 4 words. It's positive and practical. So it's not ideological. It's like, okay, we've got a massive housing crisis, the highest housing costs in the country. What do we do? Well, we need to build more housing. Look at to make that happen. It's practical. It's getting rid of the regulatory barriers, the ideological barriers to building more housing, simplifying the building code, changes every year, makes it really expensive. Developers can barely keep up. The litigation issue that we talked about earlier, the focus, for example, on housing on, again, ideologically driven, climatism, that it has to be infill, right? You can't build single-family homes. You can't extend the development footprint of anywhere because climate. Since 2018, you've had this thing that goes calculation going into any proposed development called VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And if you increase vehicle miles traveled, basically it's hard to get.
You get a higher fee, and then
Or just blocked. You can't do it because their vision of California is everyone living in apartment buildings on top of a train station. But that's not California. That's North Korea. And so we just have to be true to what people came here for. The California dream, which is not complicated. A good job that pays enough to raise your family in a home of your own, in a safe neighborhood with a good school, so your kids have a better life than you. That's it. All of those things are very simple, positive, practical things that we can deliver if you just sweep away all this ideology and just focus on practical things. I mean, we could list the policies, but it's not complicated. But what we have to do is actually get to a position where you can implement these policies.
when you were coming back from UK, the moment you felt you were going home,
Yes.
why did you think this is home now? Over
Yeah.
UK, which is a European country, right? Which is
Well, I've always loved. I mean, here's the way I'd put it. I don't just love. I'm in love with California. I really am. I feel very, very emotionally and spiritually connected here. I think it's the best place in the world, without question. Of course, we can all talk about the physical manifestations of that, our magnificent landscapes and the weather, and all that's true. But the spirit, where we started, I think that I very much identify with that spirit of optimism and ambition and energy and hustle and the rebel spirit. That's California, more than anywhere else in the world, I think. And you see that manifested over the years in the things that we've done, the creativity of our entertainment industry and the innovation in our technology industry, but also life sciences and growing. Everything that California does is just the best, right?
There's always innovation.
Yes, and we've got this sweeping, magnificent range of things that we're the best in the world at, or should be. And I love that. I'm proud of that. I'm back in the day in England when I was working for David Cameron before he was Prime Minister. There was I think this story is in the book, but that's right. It's before the election, and we were developing the plans, the policy agenda and so on. And I was very much part of that effort. And there was a story in the political magazine, The Spectator. People may read The Spectator online. This is the print edition, once a week magazine. I think it's the oldest political magazine in the world. And the cover story was the headline was California Dreaming. And the theme of the article was Steve Hilton, David Cameron's policy guru, the vision that they're developing for the UK is based on California, to make the UK more like California. This is like 20 years ago, before we lived here. And there's two parts to that. So first of all, it tells you that I've always had this connection in my mind, in my heart, to California. But also, there's not a single policy advisor to any political leader in the world today that would say, yeah, we need to be more like California. They say we need to be less like California. And that's an absolute crying shame. We need to be what we were not that long ago, an absolute inspiration to the world, not a warning of what not to do.
Hopefully that will change soon. Steve Hilton, so. TV host and author, it was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Do you agree with Steve Hilton that the state policies are causing the problems we see in the state? You can always email us at siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. We read all of your emails and comments. I'm Siamak Khorrami, and this is California Insider. We will see you next time.